Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Marum from Justice at Last. I want to apologize in advance. My allergies are out of control today, so I'm probably going to be doing a lot of sniffling and sneezing. But yes, I am here presenting with Rebecca Brackman from the Contra Costa Public Defender's Office. We're going to be talking a little bit about human trafficking and vacature. We'll be talking about the definition of human trafficking, what it is, what it looks like, the phenomenon of victims of human trafficking being arrested and convicted as a result of the trafficking, forms of legal relief that are available for such victims, and some trauma-informed practices when working with survivors of human trafficking. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. So yes, like I said, my name's Lindsay. I'm a senior staff attorney with Justice at Last, and I'll turn it over to Rebecca to introduce herself.
Morning. My name is Rebecca Brackman. I'm an attorney with the Public Defender's Office here in Contra Costa County. I've been here for a very long time and had a variety of assignments, but most recently am in charge of our post-conviction unit, in which we assist clients with post-conviction relief in many forms. Human trafficking vacature is one of those examples, and then I'll be talking to you a little bit about some of the other options that might be available for the clients and folks that you work with and how to access those.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Justice at Last, the organization I work with. So we are a nonprofit law firm in the Bay Area. We are the only organization, I believe, in the Bay Area that exclusively serves the legal needs of survivors of human trafficking. Our goal is to provide trauma-informed wraparound services to victims of human trafficking through interdisciplinary representation. So kind of the two buckets of things that we do are providing direct legal services to victims of human trafficking, helping them with legal needs such as, post-conviction relief, immigration relief, crime victim rights, credit repair, things like that. And then the other big bucket we do is providing training such as these to help educate, stakeholders and members of the public as a whole about what human trafficking is, how to best work with survivors of human trafficking. What's unique about our organization too is that in addition to our legal team, we also have a client advocate team. So our client advocate team works with the legal team to provide emergency crisis management and support services when needed to survivors of human trafficking, such as ongoing safety planning, helping them get connected with benefits, providing, emotional support during calls, because as we know, these things can be very difficult for survivors to talk about. So kind of through the stabilization that the client advocate team provides, our clients are better able to address their legal needs because, their benefits, their emotional well-being, all that, the client advocates really help to stabilize all those things. So this is a little bit about the clients we serve. Prior to 2018, most of our clients were female sex trafficking survivors. Not surprisingly, the awareness of what human trafficking is has kind of grown a lot in the past few years. There's a lot of misconceptions that it only involved women, only involves foreign nationals. It has to be, across country lines. You can only be trafficked for sex. We've actually seen a really big uptick in the identification of labor trafficking the survivors and also male survivors. Currently the majority of our clients are female, but a good portion are male. Over 50% identify as individuals of color. And a good majority, about a third, speak limited English. So, this goes to show that anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, but there definitely are certain groups that are more vulnerable than others. And these are the areas where we provide legal relief. We do crime victim rights for clients who report their trafficker to law enforcement and the trafficker is later arrested and or prosecuted. We collaborate with the district attorney's office to make sure that all the victim rights are being enforced. You know, like the victim's right to a protective order if they want one, the victim's right to be heard at any important proceedings, the right to recover restitution, things like that, and just overall making sure that the victim is treated with fairness, dignity, and respect throughout the legal process. And then on the other side of things, when our victims find themselves on the other side of the criminal justice system, if they are the ones being arrested or prosecuted, we provide post-conviction vacature services, which we'll be talking about today, We can also help individuals with credit repair. Oftentimes, many traffickers will take our clients' financial information or they will force them to do petty financial crimes that adversely affect their credit score. So, we have pretty good luck with being able to get those clients' credit scores up if they've been negatively impacted by the trafficking. And then lastly, we also provide immigration relief. Individuals who've been trafficked in the US are eligible for a specific type of visa called a T visa. And so we helped individuals apply for those visas, potentially adjust to green cards as needed. Um, and if there are legal needs that we identify that we cannot assist with, we have a very robust referral network that we will send that we can refer those individuals to. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what trafficking is. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was enacted in 2000. It was kind of the first comprehensive federal, not only the first comprehensive federal law, but really one of the first laws in general to address trafficking in persons. While trafficking in some ways is kind of the oldest profession there is, it's only recently been recognized as a crime and recently made its way into the legal discourse. So it's kind of the law is modeled off these four approaches to fighting human trafficking. The first is to prosecute the traffickers, then protect the victims, prevent trafficking from occurring, and partnership. And kind of, I think we fall into all of those categories. I think all of our work, but again, meetings like this, I think are most important for partnerships. Speaking with each other, figuring out what best practices are, things like that. And so this law is what many state laws are based off of. Every state has their own definition of human trafficking and they vary somewhat, but they're mostly based off of the federal definition. So under the TVPA, there are two types of trafficking. Um, the first is sex trafficking, and that is where a commercial sex act, so that means a sex act in exchange for money or something of value like housing, food, things like that, is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person to induce to perform the commercial sex act is under 18. So if you are a minor, if someone just induces you to perform a sex act for value, you don't need to show force, fraud, or coercion, which we'll talk about what those terms are in a bit. So that's sex trafficking, I think, which is what most people are familiar with. But people can also be trafficked for labor. And that is when someone is, similarly induced. Either they are recruited, they're harbored, they're, kept somewhere, they're transported, they're brought somewhere, and just made available to provide labor services. Again, through this use of force, fraud, or coercion, for the purpose of being subjected to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. So those four terms are kind of terms of art. They basically mean that, you're not working because you want to be there. Oftentimes there can be individuals who are in a who are in a work situation that may be exploitive. Maybe they're not getting paid enough. They're not given their breaks. Their bosses, aren't the best. But what's really keeping the person there is that employer, making threats or, otherwise making that person feel that they will not be safe something else bad will happen if they have to leave. Um, so those are kind of the two buckets of trafficking we see, individuals who are trafficked for sex and also individuals who are trafficked for labor, other services. So these terms, force, fraud, or coercion, this is kind of what trafficking, like what gives cause to trafficking. So these are the three ways that an individual is typically made to provide, commercial sex or labor services. The first way, force, that is like any type of physical force that can include, sexual assault, any type of physical violence, confining someone somewhere, like locking them up so they can't leave. Physically taking someone's passport, depriving them of food, basic necessities, all that. Um, the second branch, fraud, that's inducing someone into a trafficking scheme under false pretenses, telling someone, oh, if you come to the US, if you come work for this farm, I'll pay you a good wage, you'll be able to take care of your family. If you come do this for me, um, if you make money for me, we often see this too in the sense of like romantic partners and how they recruit people for trafficking, presenting themselves as like a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a loving partner, bringing someone into the scheme, gaining their trust, and then saying, oh, well, if you love me, if you do this, if you do that, we'll be able to be together. You just have to make some money for me. So yeah, just any false promise that, had the person not been told that false promise, they wouldn't have gotten into that situation. And then lastly, coercion. So coercion is basically threats of serious harm or any scheme, pattern, or plan made to think that that person would suffer from serious harm if they didn't comply. So a trafficker might not use actual physical force, but they can repeatedly say, hey, if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt your family. It can also be threats to other people. Forms of psychological abuse, you're nothing, you're worthless. You're nothing without me. And then also threatening to use any type of legal or administrative system against someone. If you don't do this for me, I'm going to report you to the police. If you don't do this for me, I'm going to report you to immigration. I'll report you to this licensing board. So yeah, those are the types of force, fraud, coercion we typically see in trafficking schemes. So the term severe form of trafficking, is a bit of a misnomer. We don't typically get people coming to us and saying, well, I was trafficked, but it wasn't severe. Basically, severe just means all those things that there has to be force, fraud, or coercion. Individuals, they don't have to be exploited for any type of, oh, you were only exploited or you were only, coerced 3 times versus 10 times. So it doesn't have to be a certain severity. It also doesn't have to be a specific duration of time. I've had clients who are trafficked for days, if not hours. And because they were forced to provide labor services because of force, fraud, or coercion, it counts. It doesn't have to be a certain time length. And then within California, trafficking is defined under California Penal Code 236.1. It largely mirrors the federal definition. Um, Instead of severe forms of trafficking, it defines it as, depriving the personal liberty of another. So just like different terms of art that all mean the same thing. Additionally, we talked a little bit about coercion, threatening to report someone, making threats of serious harm. Under California law too, facilitating the possession of a controlled substance to someone with the intent to impair their judgment also counts as a form of coercion. We see this a lot where our clients, their traffickers make them take drugs or otherwise get them hooked on drugs. And that makes them more malleable and, willing to consent to do things and provide labor services that they otherwise wouldn't. So that's, the definition of human trafficking. And now we're going to talk a little bit about how this impact, survivors, how they are impacted by the criminal justice system and, relief that can be available to them.
Lindsay, before we go there, I just have one quick question about labor
Yeah, of
trafficking,
course.
because I was really struck by the percentage of labor trafficking cases that your organization has handled. And what do you think caused that rise in the number of labor trafficking cases, and where are they from?
Yeah, so I think it's not so much a rise in the amount of labor trafficking cases. I think it's a rise in the identification and awareness. I think when people are looking for, I think when people are, have their eyes out or like looking for trafficking, I think, you know, prior to a few years ago, everyone would always think sex trafficking. And now I think that, there always has been labor trafficking, but it wasn't quite recognized as a crime. So someone who might come forward and say, oh, I had to do this and that, like people might not have realized at the time that that was labor trafficking. Um, so I think it's just kind of like a general awareness. And then it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling cycle in some ways where it's like the more we become aware as a society of what trafficking is, the more survivors realize, oh, I didn't think I was trafficked because I didn't have to do sex or anything. But, now I'm realizing that this did count as trafficking because I had to provide labor services. So, the more victims are able to self-identify, then they're able to come forward. And the more victims that come forward, the better idea we get of what trafficking looks like and the better we are able to identify it. So the more people that come forward and self-identify, it just kind of creates a cycle of being able to identify. And I will say too that there can often be like a pretty big overlap in sex and labor trafficking. Some examples I can think of is an individual who is like kept in sexual servitude, and then when they are not being forced to see clients, they have to clean around the house or provide dinner to whoever they're living with. Or maybe on the flip side of it, clients who, their trafficker makes them do petty theft, credit card schemes, other, restaurant work under the threat of, well, you have to make money for me one way or another. I'm either going to send you on the street and make you do sex work or you can do work here. So they often can go hand in hand as well. And as far as where it's happening, I think the most common industries we see are agriculture, restaurants, care homes. And then as we'll talk about too, there's also a really big, um, like within illegal industries too, we see a lot of labor. So I can get into those on my next slide, but did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. And are most of your clients self-referred or do they come through other organizations?
It's a pretty good mix. We definitely get a healthy amount of self referrals. We get referrals through partner organizations. I'd say it's a pretty good combination of both.
Thank you. And while we are at this stage, really learning about the definition, there's a question from Monica in the chat. Does sexual harassment in the workplace count as human trafficking? Monica, if you want to provide some context to your question, you are welcome to do so. You could unmute yourself, Monica, if you want to. If not, we'll try to interpret your
Um,
question. Go ahead.
yeah, so a lot of times when you're there's clients that are like cleaning houses or just in general on they're undocumented, and if they don't do like a certain sexual act, and they're being if you don't do this, then you're gonna lose your job type of thing.
Yeah, so we actually see those situations a lot, and it can be kind of tricky because, sexual harassment and, trafficking are two distinct legal terms. So typically, if someone's being, sexually harassed at work, um, that might on its own not rise to the level of human trafficking because with trafficking, there has to be some force, fraud, or coercion. What we might see, so an example that might not rise to that level is if someone's being sexually harassed at work, but there's no other, you can't leave or you have to stay here threats because you have to look at what's keeping that person in the situation. If the person's staying in the situation because it's like, well, I need to put food on the table, I need housing, I can't afford to lose my job, obviously very valid reasons for staying, but, you need to look into whether or not the trafficker is leveraging that. If the person, like, by all accounts, does have the free will to leave, even if that means they're not gonna have housing or a job or things like that, it might not rise to the level of trafficking. However, and we see this a lot with undocumented individuals, employers who leverage that and say, well, you're illegal, you're not going to be able to get a job here anyway, or oh, if you leave, I'm going to report you. The trafficker just has to leverage that in some ways so that it's the trafficker making the person think that they cannot leave. So if it doesn't rise to that level of the trafficker actually leveraging and manipulating those facts against the person, so the person feels like they don't have the free will to leave, it might not rise to its level. It's still, a crime and illegal, but it just might not have the remedies that are available for victims of human trafficking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think also it sounds like you really have to do in-depth factual analysis to really look at the facts of each case. So thank you for that. Serene, you have your hand up patiently. Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, good morning. Um, my question, well, I have a comment regarding labor trafficking, um, and two examples that I have had. I've had a high school person, and again, he was brought over from Mexico as well, and so he was labor trapped. He was brought to the United States to specifically perform labor trafficking. So he worked and was drugged to continue to work for, and it was his relatives that was labor trafficking him. And I was called in to assist him. So that is another form for labor trafficking. They could also be children that come across the border illegally from relative to do work. Um, and then I've also had nannies that were brought over to specifically watch children and being paid under the table, working hours, way more hours, and also sleeping at the residence with the children. So there are many forms, in my opinion, as far as labor trafficking, and not necessarily the obvious.
Thank you. Where do you work, Serene?
Oh, I used to work for community violence solutions, and so I've also continued to study human trafficking as well as labor trafficking and exploited children. Um, so right now I work for Hope Solutions, but I stayed under this subject because of the fact I find that not enough people assist. So I study on my own now and still go to the trainings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did anyone else have any other questions? Okay. So it's actually quite common for victims of trafficking to get arrested, as a result of the trafficking. Statistics as a whole on trafficking are not great. There's not a lot of studies on this phenomenon. It looks like there are some studies that are going to be coming out, hopefully in the next like few years, by stakeholders in this area. But from numbers we have seen, you know, a vast majority of human trafficking survivors report being arrested while being trafficked. Half of them report being arrested as minors, and significant number report being arrested 10, 20 to 30 times. And that is oftentimes what we see too. I don't think I've ever actually worked with a trafficking survivor that's only had one arrest or one conviction. It always is multiple. So these are typically examples of the types of crimes that human trafficking victims are arrested for. I don't like this term, but it's just the legal term, so I'm going to use it. Quote unquote prostitution, loitering with intent to prostitute, things like that. Things related oftentimes to being forced to provide commercial sex. Theft too. Oftentimes traffickers will make their victims perform, like deposit cards fraudulently, steal things from stores, panhandle, beg, things like that. We also see a decent amount of alcohol and substance related offenses. Many times, our clients, as a result of the trafficking will, whether they're forcibly drugged by their trafficker or they develop a substance abuse problem to cope with the trauma of the trafficking, that can sometimes result in later arrests even after they've escaped the trafficking. And forced drug sales and cultivation is also an area we see too. Individuals being forced to work in marijuana groves or sell drugs on the street. Um, and originally, when all these human trafficking vacature statutes first came out, they were only limited to vacating prostitution offenses. But states most recently have begun broadening their vacature statutes to include more than just vacating, offenses related to sex work, which is good because it recognizes that oftentimes victims of human trafficking are forced to commit a wide variety of acts that go just beyond commercial sex as a result of the scheme. So, being forced to engage in criminal acts is very difficult for survivors. It has a wide impact on the rest of their lives. It can make it very hard to apply for and obtain jobs. If this criminal record is coming up every time they apply for a new job, it can make it difficult to pursue education or get, a higher degree. It is a barrier to getting housing support, applying for a loan. It could potentially be used against them in a custody matter by the other parent. It can make it hard to access public benefits, to get immigration relief, because that is something you have to disclose when applying for immigration relief. And generally, it's just very traumatizing because, every time they go through a process of having to get a job, looking for an education, applying for benefits, things like that, if this is always popping up, it's just a constant reminder of the trafficking that follows them wherever they go. So post-conviction laws are very important because it removes those barriers. So victims are able to best stabilize and it can prevent re-victimization. If they oftentimes, because, with a criminal record, if you're not able to get housing, if you're not able to get a job, if that criminal record is a barrier, that can make you a lot more likely to be re-exploited because a trafficker could take advantage of that. Look, you're not going to get a job anywhere else. You might as well just work for me, or you have to work for me. It can also remedy this past injustice of, you shouldn't have been arrested or convicted. This wasn't your fault. You were a victim. So it can be a very empowering survivor control process, an opportunity for one to reclaim or tell their story. We also strive to have this impact on the criminal justice system stakeholders, educating judges, prosecutors, court personnel of like what trafficking looks like, and that helping distinguish between like, hey, this person, like, yes, they were arrested or convicted, but they didn't have the requisite intent to commit this crime because they're being forced. And as I said before, most states have some form of record clearance relief available for human trafficking survivors. And we will get into California specifically, but I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to talk a little bit about the work the PD's office is doing.
Good morning again. Lindsay, are you okay advancing the slides for me? Okay, perfect. So I think that my piece here is to talk about how some of the backdrop of the specific relief available for human trafficking victims, and in the hopes of having this community understand that we should be thinking proactively about how it is that we can help folks who've been victimized, who've been categorized, perhaps mistakenly previously, access all of the things that can help them have a better future. And so I wanted to talk just very briefly about human trafficking vacature is one of a number of, I would say, recent expansions of looking at, what's called second look legislation, or means of looking back at previous convictions. And part of the reason for that is because I think that we as a society, the criminal legal system, have recognized that we aren't doing favors necessarily to our communities in terms of safety by having impossible barriers for those who want to reintegrate and return to their families and be productive members of society. I think that it's also acknowledging that some of our heavy punitive without understanding the circumstances that brought about a technical violation of the law, as in the case of the human trafficking victims, were things that targeted, already marginalized communities disproportionately. And then I think there is a part also that acknowledges that the same person who might have committed the bad act in the past isn't necessarily the person who is there in our community today, and that we want to recognize that sort of process of rehabilitation and transformation. So that is part of what I see in my work as what has become an expansion of how we look again at the cases where folks were convicted previously, again, including those who were human trafficking victims. Can we go to the next slide? So this is not an exhaustive list. This is a list of some of the more common areas that my office specifically works with clients to seek some sort of post-conviction relief. I'm not going to go in depth about all of these, but part of the reason that I'm talking about them in the context of this training is that human trafficking vacature has certain benefits and also certain requirements. And to be honest, there's probably people who have been victimized as human trafficking victims who committed crimes that are tied to their trafficking, and who may have committed other crimes that we're not going to be able to get vacature for because of the nexus or the requirement that there's some sort of connection there. But I want to urge those who are working with victims or anyone seeking to relief to be thinking sort of expansively and creatively about what it is that might be available, and thinking about what it is that will help solve whatever their problems are. So again, this is a list of some of the things that are possible and our office specifically offers in Contra Costa County. And I know that most other public defender counties now have a post-conviction unit. I noted that we have people here who are from other counties, and that's great. And the advent of an increased avenue of post-conviction relief, there also was some additional funding provided to public defender offices. So nearly every public defender office has a unit that's engaged in trying to look at these options. And these are areas where we have been able to affect great change for some members of our community, and giving them a second chance and acknowledging the circumstances in which their crimes occurred and how they are a different person at this point in time. So do you want to go to the next slide, please? So one of the things that I wanted to ensure that this community who's working, to me, it seems like kind of directly with those who might need assistance in this area, some direct contact with the clients, is that what it is that is available and also most beneficial to a client is going to depend on a few different things. And so these are some of the questions that I think are helpful to you, to this community that are working directly with those who might need this assistance, is to think about what vulnerabilities contributed to the criminal conduct and conviction. The human trafficking is a perfect example of that. I'll talk about a couple of others where what you think about is, who was this person at the time that their offense happened? And that might allow a certain avenue of relief, okay? What is the ongoing harm from conviction? Is this something that is prohibiting them from, decreasing the length of probation might be the exact thing that a client needs if they want, what they want to do is move. If the harm is that they are being restricted in somehow in where they live. Is it a registration requirement? Is it a licensing requirement if they want to be a nurse? And so what it is that the client specifically needs, or this, the harm they're experiencing, will help inform what type of relief is most beneficial. And we'll give just a couple examples of those. And then what is the way to prevent ongoing harm? Okay, sorry, next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to, there was that list on my second slide of like basically about 10 different types of post-conviction relief. And I just wanted to talk about a couple so that you understand that there is a difference, and we don't want to give every client an expungement necessarily. We don't want to do the same thing for every single client. We need to be sort of client-centered in thinking about who they are, what the vulnerabilities are, and what is going to help them solve their problems. And so expungement and certificate of rehabilitation are two different legal means of post-conviction relief. Each have different requirements. So some clients may not meet the requirements. They may not have had 7 years without police conduct, for instance. Some of them, like the certificate of rehabilitation, if someone's trying to go to nursing school, they need that, not the expungement, okay? So you can see here that even though these are two different pathways for helping someone reestablish themselves in the community, we need to be thinking about what it is, who they are individually, what is going to help them solve their problem in terms of how their conviction is impacting them today, and how it is that they might have, there might be hurdles. There's certain offenses, for instance, that you can't get certain types of relief. So again, just encouraging the folks in this community who are working with clients that want assistance for rebuilding their lives, being productive members of society, shedding that past sort of harm that's happened, is that it's a part of identifying what it is that will be most helpful to them. Okay, the next slide. And so this is another example of, you remember my question, if I'm thinking about this process with the client and being client-centered, is also who they are at the time that the conviction happened matters, because we have different pathways based on that. Again, Lindsay's doing a terrific job talking to you about human trafficking vacature, and that's one example of a vulnerability that that gives you some direction about what's possible. But there's a number of others for our clients who are non-US citizens. So there's a number of different types of relief: reduction to a misdemeanor, expungement, a 1203.4 vacature. And the thing that's really important to remember for these clients is that we need to get the one that is going to, if their concern is immigration and their ability to remain in the country, we need to get the specific relief that does that. And that's typically a 1473.7 like complete vacature. And the thing that's really important to understand about that is that it doesn't require victimization necessarily, but there was a period of time in which many clients were not being properly advised as to the immigration consequences of a plea, and they are entitled to either have a safe replacement plea or a vacature. This is a fair amount of overlap, I would expect, with human trafficking victims, because as Lindsay's diagram showed, that there's a number that are non-English speaking that might be brought from other places. And again, there might be a problem with, there might be some difficulty with showing a nexus between the crime that they committed and the human trafficking offense. But that won't matter for the 1473.7. It won't require that it be just the crimes that are connected to the victimization. If you were not advised properly by an attorney, then you would be entitled to this replacement. And then with veterans, again, that's a vulnerability that for a very long time, the courts simply didn't account for how that experience might have impacted, mitigated, influenced criminal conduct. And now there is a form of post-conviction relief, which essentially says if there was service, there was any kind of trauma or condition related to that, and it wasn't considered at sentencing, which it almost never was until very recently, that there is another pathway for relief. So I think that my piece that I add here is just to make sure that we're thinking sort of expansively about the ways in which someone's how they came to committing their prior offense and how it is harming them can really be informative in what type of relief they should be seeking. Okay, next slide. So this is Contra Costa specific, but again, I think that there's a parallel for every other county in California that our office accepts referrals for post-conviction relief. Most of them come through for our clients who aren't in state prison through our Clean Slate portal, and we have community events. We partner with different community organizations. It's a very simple application, and then it's analyzed to see, hey, is this person most served by this type of relief or this type of relief or that sort of thing. We also, a bulk of what I work on is cases in which someone is in state prison and entitled to relief. And so those come in through a sort of different mechanism. I will say that probably if anyone has a client who presents with a family member for which they're seeking some sort of post-conviction relief, we're happy to receive those referrals. And then the next slide, which I think is my last one, was just to say that there are other community organizations which work doing exactly the work that Lindsay described. Her firm does for human trafficking, for other types of clients that does the same sort of occupational licensing, employment, housing. That's wonderful to be able to offer to a client. And so East Bay Community Law Center is one of the organizations that offer this. And so those are also places that you can make referrals. Hey,
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was great. Thank you so much. Educational for me too. Because I'm very focused on the vacature context, and I sometimes forget how many like different avenues of post-conviction relief there are. So to kind of quickly, kind of re-go over what Rebecca talked about, there are many types of post-conviction relief. Again, it depends on, the circumstances of, the survivor or the individual, like who they were at the time, what has happened since then, what the charges were, things like that. So kind of what makes vacature unique from a general sealing or expungement case is that, with sealing or expungement, it may make the records like disappear to the public eye. It could be a finding of like, oh, you've rehabilitated, so we're gonna like take this conviction off your record based on your rehabilitation, based on the fact that 10 years have gone by since then, based on the fact that this is no, things like that. However, the conviction, the arrest is still there. It doesn't necessarily go to the arrest or conviction should not have happened in the first place. And that's what vacature is. Vacature under the California Penal Code, vacature is basically saying any arrests or adjudications that happened, like while you were a victim of human trafficking, are deemed not to have occurred. That's the language it uses. So instead of it just disappearing or being taken off, it is undone. So the vacature statute for victims of human trafficking is codified in Penal Code Section 236.14. It was enacted in 2017, and it was designed to give victims of human trafficking a fresh start by creating a pathway to erase any non-violent arrests and convictions. So that is an important aspect of vacature that can be a little bit limiting, is that it only applies to non-violent offenses, which are defined by Penal Code 667.5. Those include things like murder, burglary too, things like that. Typically like violent offenses against the person. The law, in the legislative history, it recognizes that victims are often trapped in a vicious cycle of injustice, even after they escape the trafficking due to the lasting effect of a criminal record. I talked about that a little bit previously. Someone can get arrested while they're being trafficked, and then it makes it even harder for them to find legitimate employment or housing, or it can result in the trauma of that arrest can result in, additional substance abuse. And all those things make someone vulnerable to being re-trafficked potentially rearrested, and the cycle goes on and on and on. So by eliminating that criminal record, it can really help to pull that person out of the, cycle of abuse, the cycle of exploitation. So in order to qualify for vacature relief, this is what a petitioner, that's what we call the defendant slash survivor, the person who was charged with the crimes. This is what they need to show. They have to show that they were a victim of human trafficking at the time of the alleged commission of the qualifying crime. The arrest or conviction of the crime was a direct result of being a victim of, sorry, this should be human trafficking, not sexual violence. And then lastly, that their conviction is in the best interest of justice. So, a little bit of notes on that. Like, we've had pretty good luck with getting charges vacated even after someone has escaped the trafficking scheme, as long as we can show that it ties back to the original victimization. So again, for clients who, were trafficked and now they have a substance abuse problem or an alcohol abuse problem, and they get a DUI charge a year or a few years after the arrest, after they escape the trafficking. Typically we've had pretty good luck with being able to tie those back to the original trafficking of, like, look, this is a result of the trafficking. Again, it has to be a qualifying crime, so it can't be violent. And, there used to be, the statute did used to say that you had to show a good faith effort to distance oneself from the trafficking. However, a recent amendment did remove that. And again, that kind of further goes to show the difference between these, like, rehabilitative, more expungement-based statutes that show, like, you have rehabilitated, like, yes, you committed the crime, but you have since changed and, rehabilitated versus, you weren't guilty of committing this crime to begin with. And then, so this is Penal Code 236.15. So just to briefly talk about this too, this is actually what the elements of that are. It's the same as it's the same, except it applies to victims of sexual violence or intimate partner violence. So if individuals who have suffered from sexual violence or intimate partner violence, can show that any crimes they committed were a result of that violence, then they can also get their charges vacated. So this is kind of the life cycle of what vacature is. Basically, if you're working with a client who's trying to get their charges vacated, you start with the preparation. Typically, we get our clients fingerprinted at both the California and federal level. Sometimes, charges may come up on the California live scan, but not on the federal one, and vice versa. And also, many clients, in addition to having multiple arrests in multiple cities or counties, can also have different arrests in different states if the trafficker transported them around the country. So it's good to get a federal check too, to see if they need to be referred to services in other organizations, to other organizations in other states. Once we get the background check and we know how many arrests and convictions there are, we conduct interviews with the clients to figure out, hey, like, was this conviction a result of the trafficking? Can you explain the circumstances more? Gathering police reports can also be really helpful too, to get more of a narrative of the offense, especially because if many of these crimes were a long time ago, victims might not remember, they might have blocked it out. Then when we're drafting the petitions, we reach out to district attorneys to see if they'd be willing to stipulate. So, this petition, like any type of motion, you file it in court. The kind of opposing party, which in this case would be the state, the district attorney's office, they decide if they're going to oppose, and then the judge ultimately decides what happens. So if you are able to get the district attorneys to say, hey, we stipulate we're not going to oppose your motion, we think that we agree that this person should get vacature relief, then typically the judge can just kind of sign off the box, can just sign off the order. So, having good relationships with good district attorneys and, like, trainings and things like that, and raising awareness of, like, what trafficking is and being able to make a good argument up front about why your client is eligible for relief is good, because then that means you don't have to go through a full hearing process. And again, like I said, many times you're going to have to work with multiple district attorneys because your client will have multiple arrests or convictions in multiple counties. We file these petitions. We try to file them confidentially or under seal. It actually is required by the California Rules of Court that these things be filed confidentially to protect victim privacy. And then if need be, there's a hearing. If it's stipulated to, judges will often just sign off on it. If it is a hearing, then, we kind of go through the hearing process. If the order is granted, then we make sure that all records held by any law enforcement agency are sealed and destroyed. This includes making sure that, a client's live scan by the Department of Justice comes back clean, that all the charges have been removed, making sure that, all the court dockets, all the court numbers have been removed from any court systems. And then also getting clients reimbursed for any fines, fees, or restitution they paid. And for some of our clients, it's been pretty significant, like a few hundred to a few $1,000s that they've gotten back. And that can again like really help to like stabilize and like, get those funds back. So what vacature does is it basically means that the petitioner can legally say they have never been arrested or convicted of the vacated charges. This also applies in the federal immigration context too. So when they're filling out immigration applications, I will say though that there is no federal vacature law. So if you have clients that have been trafficked, but the charges they faced were federal charges, like federal drug sales or things like that, unfortunately, state vacature wouldn't relieve those offenses. But for clients with state charges, they can say on immigration applications in the federal context, they have never been arrested or convicted. As I said, any law enforcement agency with records of the vacated charges has 90 days to seal the records and then has to destroy them within a year. So again, it's not just this like, oh, like we're going to remove it. It never happened. It's destroyed. You get back any previously paid fines, fees, restitution. As we said, that can be a significant amount. And then if the client is on probation or has any outstanding bench warrants, then that is terminated. So the process can be a bit arduous. It is not instantaneous, between getting live scan results, writing the motion, coordinating with all the different agencies, getting everything destroyed. It can take a very long time. It can also be very retriggering for clients, having to do the declaration of spelling out all the trafficking, the potential of having to go to court if there is a hearing. There's a lot of different components. You're getting records. You're trying to get stipulations from different DAs. You're then going back to the courts and all those agencies and saying, hey, now you need to destroy your records. And then it often requires a lot of advocacy with those individual agencies to enforce the order. So it is, a great law, but it can take a long time to get to the finish line. So definitely needing to prepare clients of like, even if this process is successful, it's going to take a long time before we reach the goal line. And then lastly, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about promising practices of working with survivors. At Justice at Last, we really we understand that it's most we find it to be most effective when working with trafficking survivors to have practices rooted in being trauma responsive and client-centered. What trauma responsive means is basically understanding that trauma impacts everyone differently. Everyone is going to have different responses. Some people might get really emotional when they're talking about their trauma. Some people might be stone-faced. Some people might laugh. And that you can't assign one type of approach to, or one type of reaction to specific types of trauma. It is our job to be sensitive and make sure that we are providing a non-judgmental and a non-reactionary space for clients to show up as they are with their trauma response, however it is, and, being comfortable around us. We want to make sure that we're not imposing any values or ideas on the client. Sometimes when listening to someone's story, it might be natural or human to think, to like maybe wonder questions of, why did this happen? Or why was this? Or why was that? But understanding, that we all have our unique experiences, and that we can't really judge people based on the decisions they've made because we will never fully be in that person's position. And then also recognizing that we have a position of power in society relative to the client, making sure that, we feel like that the client is able to feel comfortable around us, never using like I have this education or this degree or this background, so, I know what's best for you. Using those education degree backgrounds to advise clients is very important, but never making them feel like they are, less than, or that we know better than they do. And yeah, what we really like to emphasize is that, our organization is client-centered, and that, we don't want to tell clients what to do. We want to give them as much information as possible so the clients can understand the choices that are out there for them to make an informed decision. So not, hey, you should do this, more so, okay, if you do this, this will happen. You also have this option, which means this will happen. So by giving clients a choice and also encouraging them to use their voice, that is the ultimate client-centered approach that we strive to have. And then also, we also want to be mindful about factoring in culture when understanding the role of trauma. Like I said, everyone has very different experiences. For me, as like a US citizen born and raised here, I am very far removed from understanding what the experience would be of someone coming to this country and being exploited at the border. So just understanding that I will, as much as I can empathize with someone in that situation, I will never myself be in that situation. So being good about educating myself about like what trauma might look like in that situation, and how to best work with the client to ensure that, they're able to, you know, cope with that trauma in a healthy way. Also, clients can experience like many different types of trauma. Not only can they have like their own trauma from the trafficking, they might also have secondary trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, intergenerational trauma, things that, also kind of like mix with the trauma they've experienced from the trafficking. As part of the trauma response, client survivors might often appear like they don't want help. And that might not necessarily be true. That might just be a conditioned response. They may have been confined and isolated by their trafficker, don't go out, don't get help, no one's going to be able to help you. Um, you know, Threats or actual violence may have been used against them of, you can't seek help. If you try and leave, I'm going to hurt you. A lot of there's also a lot of fear, shame, self-blame, and hopelessness that arises from these situations. This kind of dependency, trauma bonding with their trafficker. They might have a distrust of law enforcement based on past, previous arrests or convictions. Um, they could be tied to their trafficker through this debt, through this, well, you have to pay this off to me. So it doesn't matter if you leave because you still have this debt and I'm going to find you or I'm going to find your family. Traffickers may have fed them a lot of like misinformation and false promises of like, oh, if you go forward, you're going to be deported. No one's ever going to care about you like I will. So, don't report. Um, Clients might also not quite understand like the legal system and their rights. Um, there might have been opportunities for them to be identified as a victim previously where they were not, that kind of again make them feel even more helpless or hopeless of, well, the police showed up to this raid and I thought that they were going to help me, but instead I was arrested. So if they didn't believe me, then why are they going to believe me now? And then lastly, again, we see this trauma bonding and trauma can also cause a lot of cognitive distortion of not being able to view things as abuse or recognizing that something that happened was abusive. And so, by recognizing that, we really strive to implement practices that are trauma responsive. We want survivors to be empowered, recognizing that they are the boss. We give them a choice. They have the voice. They are the ones that, ultimately decide what happens. We also strive to set clear expectations too. Oftentimes, trafficking survivors have been told like a lot of lies, oh, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to help you. So we want to make sure that we're not over promising things at all. We want to be realistic in how we talk about things. It's better to set someone up. It's better to be honest with someone and say, hey, this is going to be a difficult process, but we're with you every step of the way, as opposed to, yes, this is going to be really easy. And then it's not, because it can really, breaking that trust can like really make it hard to help and like have the client trust you in the future. We strive to be timely with, returning communications to clients, being transparent about next steps, what processes are going to look like going forward. The client's confidentiality is like one of our primary concerns. And then we also want to make sure that clients are always vocalizing their needs and asking questions, so that they are as informed about the process as they need to be. So I think that brings us to the end. Does anyone have any questions? I know there was a lot of information. I actually do see some things in the chat.
Yeah, so I do have a question, Lindsay and Rebecca. So I heard you talk about qualifying crimes for vacature, and it sounds like property crimes like thefts, financial crimes like forgeries, or drug use and DUI can be qualifying crimes, but you mentioned that violent crimes are not qualifying. But I think of our clients, right, who have experienced human trafficking or domestic violence or a combination. Some of them are charged with or sometimes convicted of domestic violence crimes, physical assault. Some of them actually are charged with robberies.
Mhm.
And so you're saying that there are really no exceptions for vacature?
I think that like arguments can be made. I think that is something that would like it wouldn't result in like a quote unquote easy case, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it might require like a little bit more of like a hearing, like I think it is a case that a DA would likely not be as willing to stipulate to, and a judge might look at with a lot more scrutiny. Um, but yeah, we agree, and I think that there has been a lot of advocacy, because I think other states have similar restrictions too, of recognizing that like, hey, clients can and often are sometimes, forced to participate in like more violent offenses. So I don't think it's like a hard barrier to it, but it is a more significant barrier.
And I would just say that I guess that was a little bit of my point of that while the category or the requirement that it somehow be traced to the trafficking might be a hurdle in some cases, there are other avenues of post-conviction relief in which that would be considered very compelling mitigation. And so on that first slide, I listed like 10 different types of relief. There's currently in Contra Costa County, at least, pretty robust what's called prosecution initiated resentencing, where there is no limitation to the type of cases that they can consider, and mitigation of a trauma history of any sort is considered very compelling. And so that would be one of the instances where we could take a referral and see if there's another possible avenue. And also that immigration failure to advise of immigration consequences, it doesn't matter what the crime is. Now, whether or not the DA is willing to agree to complete vacature or a different substitute plea, but those don't have the limitations that the vacature for human trafficking have.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you mentioned that it takes a long time for vacature to be completed. Like, how long is that long? Is it a year? Is it 10 years?
Oh, that's a good question. So I wouldn't say it's like 10 years. I think that it can be like I'd say like for the simplest vacature petitions, like if it's like only one or two charges and it's all in the same county, like I'd say like a few months. And that's just again like because these agencies like they do have 90 days to seal the arrest records and they have a year to destroy them. However, that being done in practice, obviously court personnel are like very like, overworked. This is like a pretty new like form of vacature relief. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of like policies and procedures within like uniform there doesn't seem to be a lot of uniform policies and procedures within these law enforcement agencies on how to handle these cases. The Department of Justice too, they have like a really big backlog of getting these things destroyed. So even after the petition, which I would estimate probably takes between like 3 to 6 months, you also still have to wait for all the agencies to destroy everything within the time frame.
And Rebecca, for other types of post-conviction relief, would you say about the same in terms of the process?
I would say that our immigration cases we were typically getting through in maybe 3 to 6 months. And then other types of relief, like 6 months would be pretty early. I would say 6 to 12 months. Like for prosecution initiated resentencing, we have to do a really robust workup and then present and then they vote. And so I will say that the one benefit we have, and this is in fact part of how Lindsay and I met, is that we have kind of a I'm in court all the time. We have a set department for our post-conviction matters. I have a counterpart at the DA's office. We have some systems in place that allow for things to move a little bit more uniformly. And so we don't have the same, I think, the court clerk doesn't know what to do with this sort of situation. It's just that the workup to compel whoever the decider is, the court or the DA, to do the right thing, we sometimes have to spend some time with the client doing the preparation.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Isabella and Lindsay. Do you want to read it? Do you see it?
Let me see. So just to clarify, I'm not quite sure about what like the legal definition of a pardon is, because I don't know if a pardon is based. Yeah, I think a pardon is kind of more of like an expungement. Because I don't think a pardon necessarily says, oh, you didn't commit, like you actually didn't have, like you didn't actually commit this crime.
Yeah, that's right. Pardons are given even sometimes when people like that can be in response to, they're very rare. It's you committed this, but there's things around that make it so that we don't want to use it against you. Vacature is like it's erased. It's like it didn't happen.
Yeah, thank you for that distinction. There's a question about uh illegal human trafficking survivors, the Homeland Security. I think this is really talking about T visa. And Melody, we actually have Melody here from EHSD Alliance to End Abuse, and she is immigration law specialist. Melody, do you want to briefly talk about T visa, and then maybe Rebecca, you have something also that you want to add about the relationship between T visa and the post conviction relief?
Well, I don't want to steal the show from Lindsay because their Justice at Last also does immigration relief. I will just say that the T visa provides, if approved, provides 4 years of non-immigrant status. It's a pathway to a green card, and depending on the situation, you may be able to apply for uh, um, lawful permanent residence earlier than the 3 years. Usually you have to have 3 years of non-immigrant status before you can apply. And you are also eligible for a work permit. It it also makes you eligible for certain state and federal public benefits, although able you're able to access these public benefits even earlier than the grant of the T visa, and you're also eligible to include, depending on the requirements and the facts of the case, certain immediate relatives. I will also say that there is a pretty good waiver of inadmissibility which means that um, the immigration will forgive you for certain convictions that you have on your record. Um, in If the convictions can be traced or linked to the human trafficking situation. And I will pass it to Lindsay to correct anything I've said wrong, since it's been a year since I've last practiced immigration.
That it sounds like you do these all day, every day. That was like the perfect explanation of what a T visa is. I'm gonna watch this recording after, so I remember how to explain it like that.
No, I think the question, Melody, you talked about in the context of inadmissibility, but I think my question would be, let's say I'm a T visa applicant and I have committed various crimes. Some of them maybe even violent crime. So what would be my process? I apply for T while applying for post-conviction relief. Do I apply together? Like, what do I do to really enhance my chance of getting the T visa approved?
Yeah, I think it would probably depend on the case, and and I do think that it would be, when you're meeting with a client, you would want to take a look at all take a holistic approach, right? Um, and so not just focus on the immigration relief, but also like counsel the client on other um, avenues of relief that would make their lives easier, right? Depending on what they want. And I'm now going to punt it back to Lindsay.
No, yeah, you literally took the words out of my mouth, because I was gonna say I'm gonna give the really annoying lawyer answer of it depends. I would say probably I'd say the ideal course of action is to submit a T visa application with no arrests or convictions. T visas already take so long to process. You want to make the application as like as approval friendly as possible. Um, but again, with the vacature process, it can take a really long time. So I think it kind of depends on a few different things. I think it depends on the nature of the charges, how likely they are to even be vacated. Like, are they tied to the trafficking scheme at all? Are they violent offenses? Um, checking in with the client, seeing what they prefer. Like, some clients, they might, if a client, for example, has continued presence, and they might say, I'm good. I have status for 2 years. I can wait and go through the vacature process and then submit a clean T visa. Some clients might think, I need this T visa submitted as soon as possible. And so it might just be better to do that. Especially, again, like, depending on what the nature of the charges are too. If there are things that you think would be, like, on the one hand, if you think it's pretty easily vacatable, but then they also might be very easily, like, if it's all quote unquote prostitution charges that are very clearly tied to the trafficking, which is the basis of the T visa, then that might not be as big of a problem for the T visa as, other more serious offenses. Like, I know they're cracking down a lot on, like, drug offenses and things like that, even ones that are tied to trafficking. So I think it really depends, understanding what the client's priorities are, and yeah.
And that's actually an example of where we get a lot of 1473.7 immigration plea failure vacatures is drug cases. So maybe it's harder through the, vacature through human trafficking and it takes longer. Those are the ones I can get signed almost immediately.
Thank you. Does anyone have any question? While you are thinking about your question, and there is no question that you should, feel afraid to ask. Rebecca, how do people actually get services from your office? Can they actually just contact you directly?
I'm happy to take from this community any direct referrals, and then our website it's like a little clean slate application portal, and basically that would be filled out by the client themselves directly. But I get a lot of referrals from other partner organizations that help clients with immigration or other sorts of things and say, hey, this is a Contra Costa conviction. Can you help us figure out how to take care of this? And then we shepherd it on through.
Thank you. And the same question for Lindsay. Do you just take referrals directly from community partners? We could just email you.
Yeah,
If we
let
have a
me
case.
pull that back up. So you can reach us at, let me throw this in the chat. Actually, can I copy paste things in Zoom? No.
Nick is gonna put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. For some reason, yeah, it's like impossible to paste things into Zoom now. But thank you, Nick. And then this is also, if anyone's inclined to take our survey, we'd really appreciate it too. Feedback and how we could improve, what you liked, what you didn't like. If you were like the speaker kept sneezing and it was really distracting, whatever your thoughts you want to share.
Yeah, thank you for that. And also we usually email our own evaluation form, and after people fill it out, we'll also share that with you.
Okay, great.
Okay, any other question from anyone? Yes, great organization. People are thanking you.
Oh,
That's
thank
great.
you.
Oh, there is a drug charges. There's a
Oh, I
question
did see
about,
that.
yeah. Do you want to
Yeah,
answer that
so
question?
I think, like we've said, like the idea of trafficking, when it kind of first came into the legal discourse, it was this idea of like it's all like women and children being trafficked for sex. So it's sometimes harder for, other forms of trafficking to be properly identified. Like, for example, like male victims, like I think it's harder for male victims to be identified as victims of trafficking. And in our albeit like limited experience, we tend to find that like anyone can be a victim of forced drug sales. It tends to lean more towards men. Um, just based on like, like the profiles of victimization and things like that. I think, and then it's just something that I think a lot of law enforcement agencies have some hesitancy about, just given kind of like especially right now in the Bay Area, like you know, there's like a big crisis with like drugs and sales and things like that. So I think they're worried about, you know, and I'm not saying this is like true or not, but I think the worry on the law enforcement end is like worrying that if they are granting these vacature petitions for forced drug sales, that it's going to kind of like, you know, result in the problem getting worse. That it's gonna basically that a bunch of people are gonna come forward and say like, oh, well, I was forced to do this. That really has not been our experience. You know, we tend to carefully vet these claims and these callers. You know, we have like a team of experts that recognize the signs of trafficking. Um, so I think just kind of given the current landscape right now, on drugs, like especially in the Bay Area, I think it is a little harder to get those charges vacated just because of all the politics behind it. And that's why it's like really important that, you know, obviously like victims of these like types of crimes like should definitely like it can be discouraging to come forward, but we definitely encourage victims to come forward. You know, the more people that do come forward, the more stories there are to share, the more it enters into the like you know, general discourse of no, this is like a form of trafficking. And we are definitely doing our best to advocate with these agencies. We had kind of like our very first like our full vacature hearing on the issue of like forced drug sales and cultivations in a Bay Area county, and we won. And the judge actually seemed very educated and informed on the issue. But again, it varies so much depending on what court system and what county you're in.
Rebecca, do you want to add anything, any perspective on this? No? Okay, well, I think that's it for now. And what I've always said is that good meetings end early. So we are